Good morning. It truly should be outside. We should be actually out hiking together today. This would be very appropriate given the subject matter. And the subject matter today, we're going to focus specifically, I think, on Shelley. But we'll think back a little bit to Wordsworth. They're really, it's very helpful to think about the two, one in regards to the other, and sort of reinforce a number of the themes that we had from last time, while at the same time deciding amongst ourselves that Romanticism is a very broad church, that there are many different ways of being a romantic poet. And in some ways, we might say that there are elements of Shelley that make him the ultimate romantic poet. But as we examine from Shelley to Wordsworth to Keats and Byron, we're going to see quite a few different variations. And today will be one of my favorite variations, and this one relates very strongly to the hiking that you and I will all be doing later on this afternoon when we all go to the park and walk around. They didn't tell you about this? All right. We're going to be distributing hiking shoes outside of the door, and you'll be very happy to know that we have your size. It's like a bowling alley, except different. It's a lot more fun. All right, so I want to tell you a little bit about a summer, as it turns out, 200 years ago. We're going to have the Maymester anniversary next year in 2016, but for the moment it's 199 years ago. A small group of people traveled to Geneva, and they were very well known to the public, so well known to the public that when this small group of people traveled to Geneva from England, there were virtual paparazzis who were in and around Geneva awaiting their arrival. The small group included Lord Byron, who, as you know, I've tried to model my life after, which, if you know Lord Byron, is a really, really bad idea. But I love bad ideas. Shelley, who I like to think that Marcia has modeled her life after in some ways, and Mary Shelley, who we all should model our lives after. So it's a great little group, along with Mary Shelley's friend, that traveled to Geneva. And I love this. The coincidences of this story are amazing. We decided to start doing this Maymester in Switzerland 7 years ago. And in that very year, a book came out called Byron 1816. That described the summer of 1816, what it was that happened in detail. And it was reviewed in May while we were doing our Maymester in the New York Times, a gigantic review. And I was surprised because it was a Leeds University Press. It must be the only Leeds University Press book that's ever received this much attention. And I'm not too sure why this was the summer for it, but I love the coincidence of it. It was amazing. I got a lot of letters from parents saying, I just read about what my kid is doing. I like some of it. Some of it I'm a little worried about, but that's okay. So the summer of 1816, you know a lot about it because some of the really seminal works of the Romantic era were written or conceived in the summer of 1816. In particular, the work that we're going to be looking at today in first version, the Mont Blanc, but so too was this very famous story that you've undoubtedly heard about the ghost story competition that occurred in the Villa Diodati, which is here on the top, and still there. This is a depiction of it, but it's now owned by a very lucky person. I don't know who it is, but this was where, this is the place that Byron decided to rent. Now you know why I figure I should model myself after him. The Villa Diodati, where with a small group of 5, they sat around a fire and decided to see if they could tell interesting ghost stories and stories to amuse each other. It was a very, very cold summer, the summer of 1816. There had been some climatological issue that had led to a lot of clouds and remarkable colds all the way through Western Europe. And that's significant because that meant that Shelley and Byron spent a lot of time indoors. escaping the cold. And it also meant that the trip from England to Geneva in 1816 had been very difficult and arduous and dark and windy and rainy. So they sat around a fire, and as you have heard, Mary Shelley maybe told the best story. And it's a really important story for us, Frankenstein, because so much of what she describes is related to that summer. And this, as I've mentioned to you, has been the joy of doing literary travels, as it were. That is, to go whenever you go anywhere, Montreal or Geneva or Paris or Nashville, to try to visit those places where great literary works have been written and try to absorb whatever it was that the author was enjoying at that place. And I think it colors the experience of reading in very remarkable ways. I was teaching a course on the history of philology, and I found out that in the 18th century there had been a guy who wanted to go and study the works of Homer, and he went to everywhere that Homer had been when he was conceiving of and writing his works. Sometimes you have a friend that can help you in these matters, and he had a very wealthy banking friend who got him a boat and filled the boat with every single text that had ever been written about Homer, so that while he was traveling around, and this went on for years, and going to the different places where Homer had been, he was able to go into the hull of the boat and consult all of the books, all of the works that had ever been done. And he described a series of things about Homer that had never been noticed before. And he did so, I think, because he was actually sur place. He was actually in the place where they had been written. So if I can urge you to do something, I urge you to go to these. Marcia and I think I mentioned this to you 2 years ago. We've been together for a long time. I love that. We did a Yeats tour where we would go to everywhere that Yeats had written his works, and I would read them out, and Marcia filmed this. And it's a really fun way to travel, and you really do learn a lot. So what's fascinating about this particular trip that they took, one of the things is that they were there because they were fleeing. Certainly Byron was fleeing. Byron, no matter what day it was in England, he managed to do something illegal and managed to piss off the wrong people continuously, which led him to ultimately leave for good, as you'll find out with the Don Juan poem. But they were in some ways fleeing, and I like this idea of fleeing to Switzerland, which is why we do it. It's a place of strange protection. The mountains between the Jura and the Alps, you feel as though you're kind of in a different world, which you are. So they were in some ways fleeing, in some other ways escaping English summertime, which makes good sense. And they were also on the pathway of Rousseau. So what they were doing was, I like to think that they were doing a Maymester that didn't cost $10,000. Probably cost way more, actually, if I look at the house. But anyway, they were doing the same thing that we do every May at Vanderbilt. They took a group of friends, in our case students, and they went on the pathway of Rousseau, and they tried to find traces of his works wherever they went. And they would go to the places where he had been. So today, I want to do the same thing with you, but I want to go to those places where Shelley, in particular, had been. So this Villa Diodati on the top is where Byron stayed, and Shelley spent a fair amount of time. And the one under it is Le Château Chillon. Le Château Chillon, if you've ever taken a boat from Geneva, you can go, it's like a boat taxi, and you can go to Montreux, and you can go to Evian, you can go to Lausanne, and so forth. But if you go one stop after Montreux, you come to a castle. And this is a castle where another very famous work was written that summer, which is called Le Château Chillon, in which Byron tries to imagine what it was like to be a prisoner inside of this castle, which in the basement area, if you can go in there and read, You can read the Prisoner of Chillon in the actual prison room. It's really an amazing experience. So this is the type of thing that they were doing and the type of thing that they were experiencing. And I want to do that with you as regards Mont Blanc. Because one of the trips that they took was this trip to Mont Blanc and then up to la mer de glace, the sea of ice. It's very... We did this last summer. We had never been to la mer de glace before. And it changes, I think, your complete conception of what the poem that we're going to read today means. And I think that it'll pick up another theme in this course, which is global warming. The environment, after all, being the only thing that we should be worrying about at the moment. It picks up questions of global warming because the fears that they had at the time are not the fears that we would have today because la mer de glace is gone. The great glaciers that were there have all melted. So it's kind of a shocking experience to look at some of the images from the period and realize the shifts that have occurred. So that's what I want to look at with you. But before we do, we have a defense of poetry written by Shelley that will help us think more about what Romanticism is, but from the perspective of Shelley. And we can compare some of the passages to Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. So I've isolated a few passages from the defense of poetry, and we can take a look at some of them. It might be a little bit hard to read. The writing is smaller than I thought, but that's okay because the fun thing in this course is reading out loud. So he begins with, according to one mode of regarding those two classes of mental action, which are called reason and imagination. The former may be considered as mind contemplating the relations borne by one thought to another, however produced, and the latter as mind acting upon those thoughts so as to color them with its own light and compose from them, as from elements, other thoughts, each containing within itself the principle of its own integrity. I would be all for homeschooling if all people did was just read this stuff with their kids. You know, they'd know how to write, they'd know how to be out in nature. It would just be awesome. The writing is amazing. But the principal way in which this is set up is fascinating and I think extremely important, which is this relationship between reason and imagination. I like to think of it also in terms of another relationship that we've talked about, a lot of us have talked about, which is the relationship between passion and reason. So reason is that which has been favored to this point, as you know. Certainly in the 18th century is the so-called age of reason. And the ways in which you arrive at conclusions through reasoned analysis are at the center of what we read in Voltaire or Rousseau or von Humboldt and others. And the other side of it is imagination, the kind of welling forth, the passion, that which is uncontrolled, that which may be mystical, that which may be magical, but that which acts upon reason in a sense to help fill in that which reason is missing. So I think one of the ways of thinking about this course also is to think about this relationship between passion and reason, or imagination and reason, and consider that for one of the things that is true about most of the Romantics is that there's a strong favoritism directed towards imagination, a strong desire to try to understand what it means to be passionate and to make decisions on the basis of passion rather than reason. And now you know why Byron gets into so much trouble. But not just Byron. This very trip that they took was filled. Now, of course, this is a little bit of the Elvis thing, or I was going to say Taylor Swift. I don't know if we have any fun facts about Taylor Swift. But let's stick with Elvis. He's a lot more fun. The myths. And the myths of this period is that, Lord Byron, who we know is involved in bisexual and certainly homosexual relationships early on when he was at Cambridge. He also showed a very remarkable propensity for sleeping with lovely people of many different ages. And here he was with Shelley and Mary Shelley, and they were together in this place. So there's a lot of mythology Some of it may be true. It's one of the things that links us to the Beat generation. There's a lot of mythology about their complex relations during this time. So, but I think what's important about them is this idea that they come to be very much associated with passion, unbridled passion. That element in your body that you try to control, perhaps, but if you leave it sway, then it gives rise to perhaps one could argue very romantic style things. So this principle of the relationship between passion and reason, or imagination and reason, is one of the areas that's developed very strongly in here, as is the idea of finding in nature that which the imagination is stimulated by. So as we talked about last time, he mentions nature from the very beginning, and in the second paragraph here, poetry, in a general sense, may be defined to be the expression of the imagination. So if prose, reasoned prose, is the expression of reason, then poetry is the expression of the imagination, and requires a different mode of expression that in some ways Wordsworth talks about. And I think it's very much connected to this idea that in Wordsworth that we see repeated here, that there's a kind of overflowing of powerful feelings that's represented in poetry. The expression of imagination in poetry is connate with the origin of man. Okay, now this is a gigantically important point as regards Shelley, and it connects to what we were talking about last week as regards Wordsworth. Wordsworth considers that the time of, in a sense, openness that we experience is our youth, when we're maximally open to the world. All of our senses are turned on full blast, and we haven't been in some ways muted by civilization, by cities, by noise, by religion, by whatever it is. We are, what, as Freud would say, polymorphously sexual. You're open to the world. All of your senses are turned on. So Wordsworth talks a lot about childhood, with all the contradictions that we mentioned last time. Shelley also invokes childhood, but he also invokes the notion of a kind of primitivism. That there's something in a more primitive society, not in a pejorative sense, that is to be admired because it is unobstructed by the complexities of modern life. In some ways, you could argue that the Romantic period is very concerned about the dawn of modernity, very concerned about what it means to be a person living in the modern world. So if we see here, poetry in a general sense may be defined as the expression of the imagination, and poetry is connate with the origin of man, then we see this idea of a kind of historical value here, something that goes back to our very primitive nature. Man is an instrument over which a series of external and internal impressions are driven, like the alternations of an ever-changing wind over an Aeolian lyre, which move it by their motion to ever-changing melody. For those of you who are musicians, I'm sure that you loved reading this. There's so much in here that relates to the senses, but so much in particular that it relates to sound. But there is a principle within the human being, and perhaps within all sentient beings, which acts otherwise than the lyre, and produces not melody alone, but harmony, by an internal adjustment of the sounds or motions thus excited to the impressions which excite them. It is as if the lyre could accommodate its chords to the motions of that which strikes them in a determined proportion of sound, even as the musician can accommodate his voice to the sound of the lyre. So you see that this process is far more complex, this process of creating harmony. And the harmony that he describes will ultimately be linked to the composition of the poem. So the poem has these multiple levels that allows for both the visceral sensibility, but also the act of composing, as it were. And then he says, in relation to the objects which delight... I've skipped passages here, by the way. These are These are not connected, as you know from reading. In relation to the objects which delight a child, these expressions are what poetry is to higher objects. The savage, and again, I don't want to consider this pejoratively in this case. I want to link it to this idea of primitivism. The savage, for the savage is to ages what the child is to years, expresses the emotions produced in him by surrounding objects in a similar manner. The language and gesture, together with plastic or pictorial imitation, become the image of the combined effect of these objects and of his apprehension of them. So it's a whole body apprehension. And I find it fascinating that Marcia chose Shelley as her romantic poetry in our first combination, and I had chosen Byron, because in fact, there's a whole lot of the mind-body relationship in what it is that Shelley is describing here. But he's also describing, as I said, in this reference to the savage, he's, I think, pointing to an idea that you see, for example, in Rousseau and the paintings of Gauguin and elsewhere, Blaise Cendrars, for example, that somehow there's more authenticity in the savage than there is in the person in the contemporary world. And he links the savage to the child. And I love that, what he says in the paragraph there, that the savage is to ages what the child is to years. But both of them have this kind of authenticity. And both of them have this ability that we, together, are trying to recover. We're trying to actually be without the obstruction of ideology, without the obstruction of modern world, and so forth and so on, so that we can truly feel that which surrounds us in a very visceral and corporal fashion. And I think that that's a crucial notion. And of course, it's got all sorts of problems, as you can imagine. In the same way that Wordsworth has the problem of saying, yeah, children are the unarticulated geniuses because they fully absorb the environment, but at the same time, they don't have a means of understanding it. And in fact, as we saw last time, Wordsworth talks about bounding through the fields, ignorant of what he was doing or of what he was seeing. He was too wrapped up in all of his own energy. So on the one hand, yeah, the child has this incredible ability that's eventually and many times crushed, but on the other hand, it doesn't have the sensibility to articulate it. So too with this savage that he's describing here. This is a very romanticized version of this savage, which the empires were otherwise going out and murdering. So I think we've got to keep all of these very complicated contradictions in mind. In the youth of the world, men dance and sing and imitate natural objects, observing in these actions, as in all others, a certain rhythm or order. So the dancing and the singing come to be natural manifestations of a reaction to or a relationship with the environment. It's what you would do. It's how you would respond to the world. So dancing from this perspective, or singing, are intrinsic to our natures. These are, and if you think back again to Wordsworth, they bubble up inside of us. We can't help it. And that's certainly a thing that you can admire in children. Right? They sing to themselves and they talk to themselves. There's something absolutely adorable about, or they dance, right, in this completely free form. And you notice, I don't want to start with one of my 10 million hobby horses, but you notice what happens eventually is that people have trouble walking. They kind of, they've been playing so much with their cell phone and so forth, and they can't stretch, and they don't know how to get out of bed or properly, and they're all stiff and so forth. That's bizarre, because children were very good at it. So we've learned how to become weird. And again, I think that that's very apropos to what it is that we're describing here. This desire to come back to a kind of cat-like relationship to movement, a kind of natural, to be naturally in tune with our bodies and with our minds. It's very much, I think, what is being described here. And it's a complicated matter to do so, to try to recover that sensibility. But I think that the romantic world helps us to do so, and it's one of the beauties of it. And although all men observe a similar, They observe not the same order in the motions of dance, in the melody of the song, and the combinations of language in the series of their imitations of natural objects. For there is a certain order or rhythm belonging to each of these classes of mimetic representation, from which the hearer and spectator receive an intenser and purer pleasure than from any other. The sense of an approximation to this order has been called taste by modern writers. Every man in the infancy of art observes an order which approximates more or less closely to that from which this highest delight results. But the diversity is not sufficiently marked, as that gradation should be sensible as in relating to the senses, by the way, except in those instances where the predominance of this faculty of approximation to the beautiful is very great. Those in whom it exists in excess are poets. Again, the powerful the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. That's what we saw last week. And here, this sensibility in excess are poets. So this gets us back to, in a sense, why we're trying to favor passion here. Passion it's bubbling out, like you can't control it, it's too much. And that's why, in a sense, you could argue that that's why we worry about it in society, right? The acting out, certainly the Beats were all about this. This desire to act out. This has different consequences. One of them is that we get something called, we have something called poetic license, which means something different. But we have in our mindsets this idea that artists should be able to get away with things that ordinary people don't get away with. I mean, you live in Nashville, you're very familiar with that. This is why this is a reasonably enjoyable town, is because there are people getting high and staying up all night and having sex and making music. And you're like, okay, it's all right. If it's going to lead to that stuff, then we're fine with it. All right, okay. If we move down the road, we might be against it. But here, we're okay with it. And it actually, it kind of makes for a fun town. People don't get pulled over as much, and people are a little bit more, relaxed about normal human things. But that's very strongly connected to what it is. If you think that, you go to the museum, you look at Picasso's work. You're like, what a great guy. I wish I would have known him. I agree. I couldn't agree more. But the idea of morality that some people might hold is not upheld in a guy like Picasso, I have to tell you. It's just not. And we're going to be looking at a lot of other people who are like this. So, but somehow it's okay. It's okay that they do this because they're artists. Right? So you notice that in certain countries, for example, France, there is a celebration of the writer that is even more intense. So that we give license, we allow, the guy gets pulled over, you're like, oh, okay, you're a Picasso, it's okay, keep going. Have another drink, by the way. All of this comes from, in a sense, the idea that we all have that it's okay to act out if this is what you create. If this is what you can pull off, all right, you do what you do, that's fine. I mean, don't do it to me maybe, but go ahead and do it, I don't care. And it turns into, in the Beats, it turns into blatant criminality. But, you read it in the Norton Anthology, you're like, wow, this is really serious stuff. I think we're going to think about this in very dogmatic and complex terms. That's fine. That's perfectly fine. But the way that they actually live their lives is a lot. If you did a little scratch and sniff, you'd smell some things that are pretty surprising. And so this passion-reason relationship that's being developed here, this whole idea of the overflow, is something that is celebrated. And I think it's something that is worth keeping in mind, and worth keeping in mind as we discuss, various versions of morality and so forth. Because the idea that's being presented here is that if you give free rein to your passions, then it's likely that you'll be doing something a little bit more exciting, like what it is that we're describing. So, There are fascinating consequences to all of this, as you can imagine. Yeah.
I was going to make a comment. Years ago, when I took a social psychology or something class, the professor said, which I think is relevant in general to art, is that people who are normal are not creative. It takes a bit of insanity
Right.
to be able to be creative.
Right. Well, and I hate.
And in some cases more.
Yeah, but at the same time I hate that idea because it really it turns, one can feel not part of that club. and what I find really fun as a teacher is to find out that we're all in that club. So there too, it's the many contradictions that I love about Romanticism. One of the joys, the unimaginable joy, I think, really of this particular job, which is a little bit like heaven, but better, is it's like being in a subway, which is you're sitting in front of a whole lot of people, and it's not clear, on the basis of your relationship to them, which is very limited, what it is that they're capable of doing. And all of a sudden, one of them pulls out a saxophone, and one of them pulls out a juggling act, and one of them stands up and dances, and you're like, oh my goodness, there's no way I could have known that was inside of you. And one of the objectives, I think, of the Romantics, and one of the incredible gifts given to us by the Beats, is to tell you, inside of you, there is stuff you can't even imagine. Let's go out and find it. And the Beats did it with drugs. The Romantics did it with sex and nature. But whatever it takes, this is my permissive line, which I'm sure you may have found. Whatever it takes to bring it out, right? So yeah, and we all have these sides. We're all deeply passionate, and we're all deeply reasonable. And to try to access our passion is something that is at the very center of this enterprise, I think. If we go down to the next paragraph. For he not only beholds intensely the present as it is and discovers those laws according to which present things ought to be ordered, but he beholds the future in the present, the poet. So this intensity, but also this ability to look at the world and understand it in its multiple dimensions. He goes on to say that does not turn the poet into a soothsayer, but it does turn the poet into somebody who lives sufficiently broadly to be able to live in multiple times at the same time. Yeats has this image of a woman who stays up all night because the children are sleeping in the room, and she's afraid that if the fire goes out, that they will freeze to death. I must work because I am old, and the coals in the fire get feeble and cold. So the role of the poet is to keep the light on. I pay people for this, by the way. So the poet lends meaning to the world. And I think the Romantic poet helps illuminate the passion that's inside of you. The Romantic poet allows you to access the passion or encourages you to access that which is inside of you. But he beholds the future in the present. Some of these lines are just, we're sometimes memorizing lines. I think a lot of them rather not as good as these. There's a lot to be memorized in here. And his thoughts are the germs of the flower and the fruit of latest time. You don't even know what that means, but it doesn't matter. His thought is the flower and the fruit of latest time. It's amazing. So it's both the seed, but also the flower. It's that which is beautiful, but it's also that which is going to appear in the future. And as a conception of thought and imagination, that is unbelievably, I think, beautiful. On the top, he invokes love, so we have to talk about that. In this case, in the case of the Romantics, now we know, as you know, from Keats and Shelley and Byron in particular, and we could argue also Wordsworth and Coleridge, that, and it's another one of the very problematic contradictions of this era, is that if you're a good Romantic poet, you're supposed to be dead by the time you're in your early 30s. That's the plan. And I'm very familiar with this conception. It's the life of a professional skier. You live for a while and then you die. Or, as Marcia said, we went to that movie. What was it, Black Swan? Is that the name of the dance movie? Yeah. And Marcia's favorite line is, a dancer dies 2 deaths. The first one when she can't dance anymore, and the second when she dies, and it's probably the first one that's more significant. So we're sitting in the we're sitting in the movie theater, and she's bawling her eyes out. Might have been some of the champagne we were drinking during the show, but that's another matter. Bawling and crying, and I just think, because for whatever else went on in that movie, it was a very amazing depiction of this death, the death of the dancer. So that is implicit in this notion also, and this is another conception I resist. I'm in my late 20s by now, and I'm approaching my 30s, and I'm starting to think, I don't want to, and you guys are almost in your 30s, so you're thinking, that's just not true. Passion is pervasive and eternal, and we tap into it, and in some ways we tap into it far more successfully with wisdom. I find that true in everything. I think I'm a better skier now than I was when I was competing because I ski with wisdom. And Marcia, I think, is a better dancer than she was in her 20s because she dances with wisdom. And we're better, whatever. The wisdom of the passage of time allows us to access passion differently. So I want to resist this idea that the romanticism is for the youth. Romanticism gets wasted on the youth. That's nonsense. No, I think that it's an extremely powerful, for us, and maybe for us in particular, it's a powerful way for us to be in the world. And the messages, although they were written by people in their 20s and 30s, resonate very strongly for all of us. So the great secret of morals is love, or going out of our nature, and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, or person not our own. Shelley was notoriously anti-organized religion. He was a deeply, one might argue, however you determine what the word spiritual means, very spiritual person, but had it in for religion. And it's interesting, again, and it's worth knowing the nature of his life in this regard. So what you see in here is not, oh, isn't nature awesome, thank God. No. Isn't nature awesome, thank nature, or thank my imagination for representing it, or something like that. For him, there was a dogmatism about organized religion that gave answers where there were none. And this was not something that he appreciated. And he was also with Mary Shelley. And if you know anything about Mary Shelley, she came from one of the most radical families in England. Her mother was Wollstonecraft, who wrote the treatise on the rights of women, and her father was Godwin, who was an early anarchist. So the politics here is in a sense a politics of nature, and a politics of beauty, and a politics of the imagination. That runs very strongly through here, and you'll see this in the poem. So the secret, therefore, is love, and I love it. And so he also says in the next sentence, a man to be greatly good. You've never seen that before, greatly good. It's like awesome. A man to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. This relates to Bakhtin, which some of us have done together, this idea of a form of empathy. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination, and poetry administers to the effect by acting upon the cause. So if we are saved by our ability to access that which leads to the creation of poetry, then the poet is undoubtedly the unacknowledged legislator of the world. Poetry is the source of the wisdom that we all seek, from this perspective, as he's saying here. So, and you notice that he links it here to things like morality and ethics and so forth. Poetry enlarges the circumference of the imagination by replenishing it with thoughts of ever new delight, which have the power of attracting and assimilating to their own nature all other thoughts, and which form new intervals and interstices whose void forever craves fresh food. Poetry strengthens the faculty, which is the organ of the moral nature of man, in the same manner as exercises strengthen a limb. A poet, therefore, would do ill to embody his own conceptions of right and wrong, which are usually those of his place and time in his poetical creations, which participate in neither. So he's deeply rooted in the scene in which herself is creating. So so there's a timelessness to poetry, but it's not the timelessness of dogma. It's the timelessness of revolution. Revolution as in seeing into the root of things. That's absolutely central, I think, to this conception of the world, and it's a conception that I find extremely powerful and motivating. So he then talks about the cultivation of poetry and the ways in which the body, in a sense, participates in this. So this is not a purely je pense donc je suis, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. It's more like I dance, therefore I am. I walk around in nature and therefore I am. I make love and therefore I am. I am a body to which the mind responds, but at the same time, the mind-body relationship is very much broken down here. And the imagination becomes as corporal as it is physical, metaphysical. So therefore, as he says in the last paragraph that I've copied, it's not the last paragraph, but it's the last one, poetry is indeed something divine. And that's as close as he gets to religion. Poetry is indeed something divine, for the reasons that he articulates here. And it's a very beautiful and powerful argument. And I want to see now what it means. All right, so let's say that we've decided as a group that this is true, that this is the world that we wish to seek, that somehow these words are significant and have meaning. So what do we do? Well, we've been in Geneva for a while. It's about, I don't actually know how far it is, maybe about 60 or 70 miles away is Chamonix, in the valley of Chamonix. And Chamonix, I know a lot of you know, is at sea level, more or less. Verbier on the other side is completely at sea level. It is slightly higher, but not much. And it's inside of a valley in which you go from Servoz to Courmayeur, and so you've got this whole line of little villages, and then Chamonix is kind of in the middle, and Chamonix is dominated by this gigantic mountain called Mont Blanc, or as they say around here, Mont Blanc, but it's not, it's Mont Blanc. And you look, so what's remarkable about it that's not remarkable in Colorado is you look straight up 15,000 feet. Colorado, you look straight up 10,000 feet because you're already starting quite high. Here you're looking up 15,000 feet. So there's a whole lot of that. And this thing is really central to what we need to understand today. It is the kind of standing on the edge of a cliff, and first of all, feeling like throwing yourself off, which Freud called the death instinct. Or people get it on the I get it everywhere. Subway platforms, I'm always like holding myself back. I'm just dying to throw myself in front. Anyway, that's another matter. But this that moment, you're trying to capture that somehow, whatever that means. In French, the ecstasy of passionate relations ends with what is called, ends. We have a discussion about that, with la petite mort, right, the little death that you experience. And so somehow you want to stay there. This is going places that we probably don't want to go, but anyway. So we go to Mont Blanc, lines written in the Val of Chamonix, le Vallée de Chamonix. And what he does, and I have to confess to you, my reading of this poem changed last year because I try to do what I try to be consistent. I tell you that we ought to go and like read these things on sur place, and I did it. But I had sort of done it before, but not honestly. Like I hadn't been to all the places. And last year we did it, and it changed everything. And I had a whole series of realizations that I want to show you. So he's writing a poem about Mont Blanc, right, about this amazing mountain, about the Mount Everest of Europe, that he sought out with Mary and Percy as perhaps food for his imagination. Right? So he begins. 1. The everlasting universe of things flows through the mind and rolls its rapid waves, now dark, now glittering, now reflecting gloom, now lending splendor, where from secret springs the source of human thought its tribute brings of waters, with a sound but half its own. Such as a feeble brook will oft assume in the wild woods among the mountains lone, where waterfalls around it leap forever, where woods and winds contend, and a vast river over its rocks ceaselessly bursts and raves. What never struck me about this first stanza is the degree to which it is metaphysical. It is thought. He's, in a sense, setting out the parameters of that which he will discuss without reference to that which he is seeing or will see. So this is him reflecting. And he reflects in very interesting ways about this idea of the relationship between the self and the environment. Because if it is indeed the case as the universe, that the universe of things flows through the body and around us, then we're deeply connected to it. This idea that somehow mankind is different from nature is what's leading to the destruction of this planet, by the way. This idea that somehow the planet was put here for us to ruin, that idea comes from this sense that there is a radical distinction between man and nature, which in many ways is postulated in the 18th century, that our faculty of reason and so forth sets us out. They don't believe this. There's much more of a sense of connectivity, I think, in this world. What I realized, though, in reading this, that what he's talking about, and he names it in the second stanza, thus thou ravine of Arve, deep, deep ravine. He's talking about Arve. So we went to the bridge on where he had written apparently some of the lines for this poem over this river Arve, and realized that in the first 50 or so lines, he's not talking about the mountain, he's talking about the river. But he's talking about the river in relationship to the mountain, because the river is filled with the waters that are melting and coming down from the mountain. So if you've been to Chamonix, and I strongly recommend, there's a restaurant that sits, and it's got these windows. I don't remember what it's called. I never remember what it's called. And when you're eating, the water rushes by your head, and it's really rapid. It's right in the center of Chamonix somewhere. I can't remember. Right near the Central Square, beside the post office. And the water's running like crazy, and you feel the power of that river. Well, the power of that river is that it's traveling down 15,000, it's water that's traveling down 15,000 feet and ravaging, in a sense, the valley. So that being the case, then what he's talking about here is the valley itself and the river. Thus thou ravine of Arve, deep, deep ravine, thou many-colored, many-voiced vale, over whose pines and crags and caverns sail fast cloud shadows and sunbeams. Awful scene. Awful. It's awful. This is an awful scene. Yeah. Yeah, it's full of awe. It is. And it's very destructive. And it's the destruction that's also very powerfully represented all the way through this poem. Where power in likeness of the arms comes down, from the ice sculpts that gird his secret throne, bursting through these dark mountains like the flame of lightning through the tempest. When we were in Chamonix the first time we did, well, the second time I think we did this trip, there had been a storm that happened 2 days earlier, and 3 feet of snow had fallen. This is in May. And it looked like a giant had come and knocked down every third or fourth tree. So the students couldn't hike, which of course meant that I did, because it was so dangerous. It was ice and snow and trees falling down everywhere. It was crazy what had happened. And you sensed, and this storm had come in, living in the Alps is like that. A storm just comes in and tears the place apart briefly, or else leaves 1.5 meters of snow and then disappears. So it's this, and he captures this, I think, very, very strongly. So what you get here is the danger of this water as it pours down. Thou dost lie, thy giant brood of pines around thee clinging. Okay. So the pines have, the water coming from this celestial place, that is to say, these melting glaciers, because this is May again, is knocking down trees. Right? It's the force of nature. Children of elder time, in whose devotion the chainless winds still come, and ever came to drink their orders, and their mighty swinging to hear an old and solemn harmony. Thine earthly rainbow stretched across the sweep of ethereal waterfall, whose veil robes some unsculptured image, the strange sleep, which, when the voices of the desert fail, wraps all in its own deep eternity. Thy caverns echoing to the Arve's commotion, a loud, lone sound no other sound can tame. Thou art pervaded with that ceaseless motion. Thou art the path of that unresting sound, dizzy ravine. And when I gaze on thee, I seem as in a trance sublime and strange to muse on my own separate fantasy. My human mind, which passively now renders and receives fast influencings, holding an unremitting interchange with the clear universe of things around. One legion of wild thoughts whose wandering wings now float across above thy darkness, and now rest where that or thou, no unbidden guest, in the still cave of the witch poesy, seeking among the shadows that pass by, ghost of all other things that are, some shade of thee, some phantom, some faint image, till the breast from which they fled recalls them. Thou art there. This is the effect of the river on his mind. And what he's doing is he's watching his mind watch the river. This is why the Beat Generation and others would favor legalizing drugs. Because they lift the veil of civilization from you so that you can, the world, we can have an argument as to why drugs were illegal in the first place. It may be connected to that. But the drug here is nature. And the mind here is honestly, completely, and thoroughly, and in the way that he described previously, openly immersed in nature. And nature is pouring into him as he responds to it. So the poet is being what the poet is supposed to be, right? Which is maximally open, and on the basis of that which he sees, this, because that's the Rivière Arve. This is from a website called Les Catastrophes des Alpes, Catastrophes of the Alps. And it's all these images of when, a huge melt came down or an avalanche fell or something like that. And it's a picture. But this is the Rivière Arve. And given how crappy the weather was that summer, it probably looked like this. This never dawned on me until we read the poem last year, Overtop the River. We haven't talked, you notice. This is a poem called Mont Blanc. We haven't been there yet. You think this poem ought to be called La Rivière Arve, right? It would make a lot more sense. And that's a really so he's looking like this, going, holy mackerel, this is the effect of that mountain. This is all that water, all that destruction, oh my, whoa. And writing these magnificent lines. So this is, as his head is being lifted up a little bit more. I'm sorry, this is a little bit gentrified. It's hard to find the proper pictures that I was looking for. I should have had more of my own. But this is La Rivière Arve. This is what the downtown of Chamonix looks like. And now we are lifting our heads a little bit, and we're seeing not so much the foothills as the early parts, the petit balcon that surrounds us. Some say that gleams of a remoter world visit the soul in sleep. That death is slumber, and it shapes the busy thoughts outnumber of those who wake and live. Period. Dash. I look on high. This is when he raises his head. Absolutely amazing. I look on high. So I've been talking to you about the destruction of the river, and now, because in Chamonix you do this. Has some unknown omnipotence unfurled the veil of life and death? Or do I lie and dream? And does the mightier world of sleep spread far around and inaccessibly its circles? So he's asking, he's proposed a hypothesis, and now he's testing it as regards what he actually sees. For the very spirit fails, driven like a homeless cloud from steep to steep that vanishes among the viewless gales, far, far above, piercing the infinite sky, Mont Blanc appears. So you see, this is a timeline. Now, I'm guessing that what he actually experienced is something you experience a lot in the Alps. Again, the weather was quite poor. I'm guessing that it was probably not a perfectly sunny day. And when you're in Chamonix, because Mont Blanc is so huge, it has its own climate. It is completely different up on the top than it is on the bottom. And different all the way along. So when he says Mont Blanc appears, he's already saying he's looking up. But it's as though now the cloud has moved away for a moment and you, oh my goodness, you see it. It's an astonishing moment, I think. And he's celebrating that moment as he realizes just how gigantic it is. Still, snowy, and serene. That's his first glance. It's like when you meet somebody really beautiful for the first time. All you see is perfection. There's this, we have to have another discussion about the relationship between beauty and the sublime. Beauty is serene, is fixed, is perfect, is often symmetrical. Right? Flowers, the inside of an orange. Beautiful. Everything is in its place. For those of you who have read Dante, it's paradiso. Everything is like fixed. Like not my cup of tea. Very staid and staged. And that's beauty. And you look upon it and you don't want to mess with it. Right? And that's, you know, we're at Vanderbilt. We should acknowledge the new critics. The new critics engaged literature as perfection, right? That the poem, I'd say Keats's magnificent poems, are Grecian urns, perfect and rich with meaning. But it's their perfection that makes them, in a sense, unapproachable. The last thing you want to do is smash the Grecian urn. Whoops. Right? Sublime is in some ways the opposite. Sublime is specifically not in a predictable form. Beauty is predictable. If it's gorgeous on this side, it looks identical on that side. We got hands that look more or less the same. Right? The sublime is much more rugged, jagged, unpredictable, moving, dangerous, in motion. And what is being celebrated here, in some senses, is both. But what he does is he begins with beauty and then he heads towards the sublime. So your first impression is, whoa. And you might fall to your knees or whatever you do. Right? And what you see is perfection. But then when you look more closely, you realize, no. It's extremely complex and in motion and moving and rugged and dangerous. So in a sense, we move there from the snowy serene to the sublime. It's subject mountains. Okay, it's subject mountains. Mont Blanc is only one mountain among many. And if you go up to Petit Aiguille or any of the others that are in the area, Mont Blanc is the giant, but it's surrounded, of course, by mountains that lead into Italy and France. Its subject mountains, their unearthly forms pile around it, ice and rock. Broad vales between of frozen floods, unfathomable deeps, blue as the overhanging heaven that spread and wind among the accumulated steeps, a desert peopled by the storms alone, save when the eagle brings some hunter's bone and the wolf tracks her there. How hideously it's shaped or heaped around. So notice the movement here. We've gone from perfection to hideous. We've gone from, like, the first thing that you see to once you start paying attention, to realizing that, in fact, what you're looking at is a scene of ongoing destruction. Rude, bare, and high, ghastly, and scarred, and riven. Is this, and then, of course, we talk about time. So he's in the present, and he's in the past, and he's in the future. Is this the scene where the old earthquake demon taught her young ruin? Were these her toys, their toys? Or did a sea of fire envelop once this silent snow? No one can reply. All seems eternal now. There's a magnificent book that I strongly suggest to everybody called The Sixth Extinction, which describes, first of all, how we're destroying the planet, but also the ways in which the planet has gone from one extinction to the next, and the kind of movement that Darwin and Buffon were able to see in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's absolutely amazing. But what you realize that Darwin and Buffon were able to do is to see the world as it was, and then try and think. I mean, it's hard to imagine in the 18th or 19th century thinking, I wonder if those continents were connected before. Whoever had such a thought? Whoever looks at continents and thinks, maybe they're all together once. That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. That ability to see through time. And that's kind of what he's doing here. He's thinking, as he's looking at it, it looks eternal now. It looks like it's been there forever and everything. But then he says, no, wait a second. Was this fire? Was it earthquakes? Was it... All seems eternal now. The wilderness has a mysterious tongue which teaches awful doubt, or faith so mild, so solemn, so serene, that man may be for such faith with nature reconciled. Thou hast a voice, great mountain, to repeal large codes, broad and woe, not understood by all, but which the wise and great and good interpret and make felt or deeply feel. So the mountain is the code. Look carefully at that. Don't just look at it and say, wow, that's really beautiful. Look carefully at it. There's the code. That's truth. This ongoing movement and this destruction and this nature in all of its power. So the mountain itself becomes the source of our understanding of the universe. It's unbelievable, I think. The fields, the lakes, the forests, and the streams and ocean, and all living things that dwell within the diadal earth, lightning and rain, earthquake and fiery flood and hurricane, the torpor of the year when feeble dreams visit the hidden buds or dreamless sleep, holds every future leaf and flower. The bound with which from that detested trance they leap, the works and ways of man, their death and birth, and that of him and all that his may be. All things that move and breathe with toil and sound are born and die. So this is the truth of the mountain, is that the world is cyclical. Now, I should mention at this point that Byron, his buddy, right? Remember, they're probably even sleeping together. What the heck? Byron is fascinated by a scientific theory of the time called catastrophism, which you may have heard of, that Buffon and Cuvier were both interested in. Catastrophism suggests that the world has been created and recreated multiple times, and that with each creation and recreation, that the beings upon it have become smaller and weaker. The evidence for that was that when they were, the uncovering of the fossils in Paris in the 18th century that indicated that there once upon a time were dinosaurs walking around the Champs-Élysées ordering coffee. So it was clear that we were like these minables, these like small, weak things by comparison, and that the world had been destroyed and then started and destroyed and started, and it was a quasi-scientific, quasi-inspirational theory for Byron, and you see it in a lot of his works. This idea that things are constantly being destroyed and then reborn, and you get this here. So I think it's not unfair to say that if they were spending the summer together and talking together, that you see the influence one upon the other. In this time. The revolve, subside, and swell. Power dwells apart in its tranquility, remote, serene, and inaccessible. And this, the naked countenance of earth on which I gaze, even these primeval mountains, teach the averting mind. Now, you come to the glaciers. Shelley was terrified of the glaciers. The glaciers in the 18th century looked like they were on their way to destroy Chamonix. When you go up to La Mer de Glace, you take a train up to where it was, and it was a virtual sea of green and blue ice. You could still see some of the glaciers there, but they're melting. I mean, it's reality. So in the last couple of hundred years, it went from this gigantic glacier that was threatening, and it was slowly coming down the mountain, and it was growing every year. Now, then it started receding, growing every year, and it looked like it was just going to wipe out the entire town. So this idea that mankind is somehow superior and all this other stuff, no, is nonsense, because of the power and magnitude and threat of this glacier. So the glaciers creep like snakes that watch their prey from their far fountains slowly rolling on. To imagine that glaciers are like snakes is awesome. There many a precipice of frost and the sun in scorn of mortal power, have piled dome, pyramid, and pinnacle, a city of death, distinct with many a tower and wall impregnable of beaming ice. Yet not a city. Not a city. See what I mean? It's a city. It's a city of death. There's the glacier. It's a city of death. It's a big, gigantic, powerful city of death. It's going to come in. No, it's not. No, it's not. No. Just kidding. Wrong. Sorry. I thought about it a little bit more. It's not a city. See what I'm saying? That's what he does. I had this, I don't know why, sometimes and classes are so unbelievably stimulating and exciting. And last year there was a student who said that Shelley doesn't allow you to be lazy. And when you say it's really beautiful, you're being lazy from that perspective. I love that. Really? That's beautiful? No, hold on a second. Wow. That's more interesting. That's more connected. Just to look at it and say, that's a city. Oh, okay, we're done. Right? That was made by God. Okay, we're good. All right. We can go home now. We're all set. No, that's lazy. And what's fascinating is that he forces you, as you move through the poem, to be with him. You're watching his mind watch Mont Blanc. And you're watching your mind watch his mind watch Mont Blanc. This is all about the relationship between the inside of your brain and what's going on over here. It's unbelievable. So it's a city, no, sorry, false, not a city, but a flood of ruin is there. But from the boundaries of the sky rolls this perpetual stream. You notice, you've seen this before. He said there's a power that rolls through all things. That's what he said at the very beginning. Well, now it's back. But you realize if you compare what he's saying here to what he said at the beginning, it's not the same thing. That there's a power that rolls through everything is kind of, it's airtight, it's good, okay, where it's a metaphysical concept. Now he's looking at it in nature and realizing this is not true. It's in movement. Vast pines are strewing its destined path. So what does he see? He sees trees. And he doesn't go, oh, tree. Okay. He says, oh, shit, you're going to be knocked down in a little while. Vast pines are strewing its destined path, or in the mangled soil, branchless and shattered stand. So he has evidence for it. The rocks drawn down from yon remotest waste have overthrown the limits of the dead and living world, never to be reclaimed. The dwelling place of insects, beasts, and birds become its spoil. Their flood and their retreat forever gone, so much of life and joy is lost. The race of man flies far in dread. His work and dwelling vanish like smoke before the tempest stream, and their place is not known. So he has about as much respect as, for mankind's creations as is indicated here, I think. Below, vast caves shine in the rushing torrent's restless gleam, which from those secret chasms and tumult welling meet in the vale. And one majestic river, the breath and blood of distant lands, forever rolls its loud waters to the ocean waves, breathes its sweet vapors to the circling air. That is what he's talking about. Ça, c'est la mer de glace. Today it's just a big pile of gigantic stones. But this is what it was, the references, if you look at images from the time, this is the type of thing you would see. And you would never imagine when you look at this that it's not permanent. And again, that's why I think the Romantics are so incredibly important and powerful in this moment and all others, because they see the movement of time. Mont Blanc yet gleams on high, the power is there, the still and solemn power of many sights and many sounds and much of life and death. In the calm darkness of the moonless nights, in the lone glare of day, the snows descend upon that mountain. None beholds them there, nor when the flakes burn in the sinking sun or the starbeams dart through them, winds contend silently there and heap the snow, rapid and strong but silently. Its home the voiceless lightning in these solitudes keeps innocently, like vapor broods over the snow. The secret strength of things which governs thought, and to the infinite dome of heaven is a law, inhabits thee. And what were thou, and earth, and stars, and seas, if to the human mind's imaginings silence and solitude or vacancy? So part of what we've witnessed here is the sensation that the mountain doesn't need you. The mountain is there, and the mountain's waves and motions and movements and so forth will occur without you. And most of that which occurs on the mountain occurs without you. The mountain doesn't give a damn about you. But the other thing that it's about is that if we pay attention to it, and if we're open to it and we're sensitive to it, that this mountain can become, as I said, a kind of key, kind of decoder for the meaning of the universe. And that, I think, is the kind of double motion that's here. So again, it's one of the other complex relations that's developed here, is this scorn for mankind at some level, and celebration for that which mankind can do. It's a scorn for the waste and the destruction and so forth of cities and such. But it's also a celebration of what the human brain, when illuminated in this fashion, is able to accomplish. And I think that that's a very beautiful balance that links in so many ways to some of the things we were talking about last week with Wordsworth. Good times? All right, are there questions? We have another 3 hours. Everything's good. Nothing to worry about. Are there any comments or questions? Or do you? I'm hoping that what you do now is take out your paintbrushes or your pens or whatever it is, and allow this welling up to take you on and take you over. Yeah. Well, one of the things about questions
the great error of philosophy, arguably the great error of religion, and undoubtedly the great error of science in some of its manifestations, is to give answers. And one of the great powers, and Michel Meilleur, with whom I did my postdoc in Brussels, has written on le questionnement. Le questionnement is questioning and allowing yourself to be in the face of true mystery. And I think that the power of questions in Shelley's world are very much that. And the question that he's asking here is, well, what if? Or if this is what is seen, what if I'm not here? Or what if, what is this vacancy that he's describing? And I think that the power of it is you're not sure. Questions are terrifying. That's why politicians, don't even get me started. Right? You know, they fill up rooms with people who ask questions that are preconceived, and they like choose the people. They could stop on the bus, they get out, and everybody's been chosen. How come you're so good? Excuse me. It's ridiculous. Questions destroy. Questions are dangerous and powerful, and they upend paradigms that we hold dear. So the power of questions, I think, is mystery. And I think that one of the, so that's the first thing I would say about this and there are quite a few questions all the way through Shelley's writings. But the question here has to do, I think, with a relationship between the mind and nature. And that he leaves you there. You know, that you're not sure at the end of this poem whether you feel really depressed or really happy. It's the pagan world. So what you've got to feel is, you're having a good time, and this is today, and tomorrow you might be gone, and that's not actually too bad. It's just the way it goes. That's part of it, I think. But the other part of it is, wow, when you're here, like, let's look how sublime it can be. Look at the difference between beauty and the sublime. Look at what you've experienced today. This is your day. This is today. Look what you did. And that, I think, is also part of it. At least that's how I read those last two. I think the last 6 lines or so, I think, is present there. Isn't it complicated? This is a very complicated poem. Any other comments or questions?
How did your understanding of it change when you were there?
I did not see the movement of his head. I didn't see this. And when you're on the bridge, and when you're looking, and you know, you're reading the lines, and you think, oh, okay, that's the river. Oh, okay, those are the trees that are being destroyed. Okay, that's. Oh, and then he says, I look up, and he kind of looks half up, and you're like, oh, okay, so now I can see that lower line below. And then the clouds clear, and you can see all of Mont Blanc. This I had not done before. And it changed for me completely the conception of what the poem was about. So what he sees first is the impact of the mountain, and then he thinks about the mountain. And then later in the day, although it took them, I think, a couple of days to get up there, and you can still see residents, they went up to La Mer de Glace. And that, you've read Frankenstein, that's where Frankenstein's monster lands up. He lands up in this big sea of glass. I always thought of it as like the Arctic or something. It begins with the Arctic. That's not where it ends. It ends at the Mer de Glace. So when Frankenstein is chasing after the monster, that's where he is. He's up there. So again, that changes everything. When you go back and you read it, it's that trip. She even describes the trip from Geneva to Chamonix. So it's the movement of the head, and that's what really struck me. And then the other thing that I didn't notice as strongly was the destruction, because you can see it. It so happened that, you know, we've been witness to a number of storms in Chamonix, so that helped. Like, you see what he's talking about. So those are some of the things. But it's amazing. And this year it'll be, you know, we're going in 4 weeks. So yeah, it'll be another experience. Goodbye. All right, so now it's just us. We can stay together. So all right. All right, well, thank you. I will see you next week.